Tucker Carlson thought he could ambush Jasmine Crockett with gotcha questions and racial dog whistles. What happened next ended his career and changed cable news forever. The Fox News studio in Manhattan was colder than usual that Tuesday evening, the kind of artificial chill that comes from too much air conditioning and too much tension. Tucker Carlson sat behind his familiar desk, the one that had launched 1,000 controversies, adjusting his tie with the confidence of a man who'd never met a debate he couldn't win through interruption and condescension. Tonight was supposed to be easy. A rising Democratic congresswoman, relatively new to the national stage, coming into his house to talk about immigration policy. He'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat across from him in the guest chair, her posture straight, hands folded, wearing a sharp burgundy blazer that looked like it cost more than most people's rent. She'd flown in from Dallas that morning, spent 3 hours in prep with her communications team, and turned down dinner to review her notes one more time. She knew exactly what kind of show this was, exactly what kind of host Tucker was, and exactly why she'd said yes to coming on. The red light blinked on. They were live to 3.2 million viewers. "Good evening, I'm Tucker Carlson." He began, his voice carrying that familiar mix of folksy charm and barely contained disdain. "Tonight we're joined by Congressman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, who's been making quite a name for herself lately, with some rather inflammatory statements about border security. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us." Crockett nodded slightly. "Thank you for having me, Tucker. Now you've called our immigration enforcement systemically racist. That's a pretty serious charge. Can you explain to our viewers why you think enforcing the law is racist?" It was classic Tucker. Take a complex policy position, strip away all nuance, and reframe it as an attack on law and order. Crockett had expected this exact question. She'd practiced her response in the mirror that morning. "What I said, Tucker, is that when you have an immigration system that treats people differently based on where they come from, when you have policies that separate families while claiming to protect them, that's not law enforcement. That's selective enforcement. And selective enforcement based on race and nationality has a name." Tucker's eyebrow arched, that practiced look of incredulous disbelief he'd perfected over years of cable news combat. "So you're saying we should just open the borders? Just let anyone walk in?" "I'm saying we should have a system that treats human beings like human beings, not political props for your nightly outrage theater." The words hung in the air for a moment. Tucker's smile flickered, just for a second, but the cameras caught it. This wasn't going according to script. "Outrage theater," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Congresswoman, I think our viewers might find it interesting that you're lecturing us about immigration when your own district has some of the highest crime rates in Texas. Maybe you should focus on cleaning up your own backyard before telling the rest of America how to secure our borders." There it was. The personal attack disguised as policy criticism, the subtle suggestion that a black congresswoman from an urban district couldn't possibly understand real America's concerns about immigration. It was Tucker's favorite move. Make it personal, make it about credibility, make it about whether this person even belonged in the conversation. Crockett didn't flinch. She'd been waiting for this moment. "Tucker, let me help you with some facts since you seem to be working with alternative ones tonight." She reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Dallas County, which makes up the majority of my district, has seen a 23% decrease in violent crime over the past 5 years. Property crime is down 18%. Meanwhile, the border communities you claim to be so concerned about have crime rates lower than the national average." She set the paper down where the camera could see it. "But here's what's really interesting. You want to talk about my district? Let's talk about it. We've resettled over 12,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the past 3 years. These are people fleeing violence, persecution, families looking for safety, and you know what happened to our crime rates during that time? They went down." Tucker shifted in his chair. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected. "Well, I think our viewers would question those statistics." "You can question them all you want," Crockett interrupted smoothly. "They're from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Database. I can give you the exact citation if you'd like to fact-check me on air." The studio fell quiet except for the hum of cameras. Tucker's producer was probably screaming in his earpiece, but Crockett wasn't finished. But since we're talking about districts, Tucker, let me ask you something. Where do you live? The question caught him off guard. I'm sorry. Where do you live? What community do you represent? Because I was elected by 180,000 people who trust me to speak for them. I hold town halls, I answer their calls, I fight for their interests every single day. You host a TV show where you attack people like me from behind a desk. So I'm curious, who exactly are you accountable to? Tucker's jaw tightened. This was supposed to be his show, his rules, his game. Congresswoman, I think you're deflecting from the real issue here. The real issue, Crockett said, her voice cutting through his attempt to regain control, is that you make millions of dollars a year spreading fear about people you've never met, communities you've never visited, problems you've never tried to solve. You sit in this studio in Manhattan and tell working families in Texas and Arizona and California that their problems are caused by desperate people seeking asylum instead of the politicians and corporations who've been selling them out for decades. She leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm, but carrying more weight now. I've been to the border, Tucker. I've talked to the farmers, the small business owners, the Border Patrol agents. You know what they tell me? They tell me the system is broken, but not in the way you describe on this show every night. They tell me they need comprehensive reform, not political theater. They tell me they're tired of being used as props in your culture war. Tucker tried to interrupt, but Crockett kept going. I've sat with mothers who've been separated from their children for months. I've seen the detention facilities where we're spending $750 per person per day to house asylum seekers in conditions that would be illegal for prisoners. I've talked to immigration judges who are handling 3,000 cases each because we refuse to fund the system properly. That's the real crisis, Tucker, not the manufactured one you sell to your viewers every night. The color was starting to rise in Tucker's face. He wasn't used to being lectured, especially not by someone he'd clearly underestimated. Congresswoman, with all due respect, I think you're being naive about the security threats. Naive? Crockett's voice sharpened for the first time. Tucker, I spent 5 years as a public defender in Dallas. I've represented gang members, drug dealers, violent criminals, people who actually pose threats to public safety. I know what real danger looks like. And I can tell you that a mother from Honduras carrying her 3-year-old daughter, isn't it? She pulled out another document. This is a report from the Department of Homeland Security. It shows that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans. That's not opinion, Tucker. That's data. But data doesn't get ratings, does it? Fear does. Anger does. Making people afraid of their neighbors, that's what pays for your $6 million salary. Tucker's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in years of cable news combat, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. You want to talk about threats to America? Crockett continued. Let's talk about the threat of a media that profits from division. Let's talk about the threat of politicians who would rather score points than solve problems. Let's talk about the threat of people with platforms like yours who use them to spread hatred instead of understanding. She stood up, the movement so sudden that the cameras had to adjust to follow her. I came on this show tonight because I thought maybe we could have an honest conversation about immigration policy. But you're not interested in policy, are you, Tucker? You're interested in performance. You're interested in making me look angry, making me look unreasonable so you can tell your viewers that this is what Democrats are like. Tucker finally found his voice. Congresswoman, I think I'm being what Tucker uppity, is that the word you're looking for? The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. Crockett had just said what everyone in that room was thinking, but no one dared to voice. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? She continued, her voice still controlled but carrying a steel edge now. You brought me on this show because you thought you could embarrass a young black woman from Texas. You thought you could make me lose my temper, raise my voice, confirm all the stereotypes your viewers have about people who look like me. She took a step closer to his desk. But here's what you didn't count on. I didn't come here to play your game. I came here to tell the truth. And the truth is that you're not a journalist, Tucker. You're not even a commentator. You're a fear merchant. You make money by making people afraid, and tonight you picked the wrong person to try to intimidate. Tucker's face had gone from red to pale. His hands were gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles were white. I think, I think we need to take a commercial break. No, Crockett said firmly. We're live, remember. This is your show, your format. You wanted to have this conversation on television, so let's have it. She turned to face the camera directly. I want to talk to the people watching at home, the ones who are struggling to make ends meet, who are worried about their jobs, their health care, their children's future. Tucker wants you to believe that your problems are caused by people who look different than you, who speak different languages, who come from different places. But that's a lie. Her voice softened, becoming more conversational, more personal. Your problems are caused by a system that values profit over people, by politicians who take money from corporations and then vote against your interests, by media personalities who get rich by keeping you angry and afraid instead of informed and empowered. Tucker tried one more time to regain control. Congresswoman, I really think what you think, Tucker, is that you can shout down anyone who challenges your narrative. What you think is that your viewers are too stupid to see through your act. What you think is that you can attack people like me without consequences. She gathered her papers and stood to her full height. But you're wrong. About me, about my constituents, about this country. America is better than the fear and hatred you peddle every night. Americans are smarter than you give them credit for. And they're getting tired of being manipulated by people like you. She unclipped her microphone and set it on Tucker's desk. I'm done here. When you're ready to have an actual conversation about immigration policy, one based on facts instead of fear, you know where to find me. And with that, she walked off the set. Tucker sat in stunned silence for a moment, his mouth slightly open, staring at the empty chair where she'd been sitting. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting his shock to millions of viewers. He looked at his notes, then at the camera, then back at his notes. We're going to take a break, he finally managed to say. But the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media. Crockett destroys Carlson was trending on Twitter before the show even ended. The moment when she called him a fear merchant was being shared thousands of times per minute. Cable news competitors were already preparing segments about Tucker getting owned by a freshman congresswoman. In the control room, Fox News executives were having emergency meetings. Tucker's show was their biggest ratings draw, but this was a disaster. Advertisers were already calling threatening to pull their spots. The network's stock price was dropping in after-hours trading. But the real impact was on Tucker himself. For the first time in his career, he'd been completely outmaneuvered on his own show. He'd tried to use his standard playbook: personal attacks, racial dog whistles, interruption, and intimidation, and it had backfired spectacularly. Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She'd exposed his entire operation for what it was. The show limped through the remaining segments, but Tucker's heart wasn't in it. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a shell-shocked demeanor that his regular viewers immediately noticed. Social media was brutal. Tucker got schooled by a congresswoman. Carlson looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. That's what happens when you try to bully someone smarter than you. By the next morning, the confrontation had been viewed over 20 million times across all platforms. News outlets around the world were covering it. International papers were writing about the American congresswoman who dismantled one of the country's most prominent media figures on live television. But the consequences went far beyond viral videos and news coverage. Within a week, 3 major advertisers had pulled their sponsorships from Tucker's show, citing concerns about the toxic environment he was creating. Fox News' internal polling showed that even among their core demographic viewers were split on whether Tucker had gone too far. More damaging was the scrutiny that followed. Journalists began digging into Tucker's claims about immigration and crime fact-checking statements he'd made over the years. They found a pattern of misleading statistics, cherry-picked data, and outright fabrications. Media watchdog groups compiled reports showing how Tucker's rhetoric had contributed to real-world violence against immigrant communities. The confrontation with Crockett had done something no previous criticism had managed. It had made Tucker look weak. His entire brand was built on being the tough guy who could out-argue anyone, the voice of common sense, cutting through liberal nonsense. But Crockett had flipped the script, making him look like exactly what she'd called him: a fear merchant who couldn't handle being challenged by someone with actual expertise. 2 weeks after the incident, Tucker announced he was taking a brief hiatus from his show to spend time with family. Industry insiders knew what that meant. Fox was quietly pushing him aside, hoping the controversy would die down. But it was too late. The damage to his credibility was permanent. Crockett, meanwhile, saw her profile skyrocket. She was invited to speak at universities' civil rights organizations and policy conferences across the country. Her congressional office was flooded with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and endorsements. More importantly, her confrontation with Tucker had shifted the entire conversation about immigration, forcing other media figures to be more careful about how they discuss the issue. 6 months later, Tucker Carlson's show was quietly canceled. Fox cited changing viewer preferences and a desire to refresh their evening lineup. But everyone knew the real reason. The man who'd built his career on intimidating guests and spreading fear had been undone by a congresswoman who refused to be intimidated. In her first interview after Tucker's cancellation, Crockett was asked if she felt vindicated. She shook her head. This was never about Tucker Carlson personally. It was about the kind of media environment we're willing to accept in this country. It was about whether we're going to let fear and hatred dominate our national conversation or whether we're going to demand better. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Tucker made the mistake of thinking that because I'm a young black woman from Texas, I'd be easy to intimidate. He thought he could use the same tactics that had worked for him for years. But those tactics only work when people let them work. The moment you stand up to bullies, the moment you refuse to let them control the narrative, they lose their power. The interviewer asked what advice she'd give to other public figures facing similar attacks. Crockett smiled. Come prepared, know your facts, speak your truth, and never ever let someone else define who you are or what you stand for. The moment you let them make it about your identity instead of your ideas, you've already lost. But if you stay focused on the issues, if you keep bringing it back to the people you serve and the problems you're trying to solve, bullies like Tucker Carlson become exactly what they've always been: irrelevant. The confrontation that lasted less than 10 minutes had changed both of their careers forever. Tucker Carlson, the man who'd terrorized guests and spread division for years, had been exposed as nothing more than a paper tiger. And Jasmine Crockett had proven that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to stand up, speak truth, and watch them crumble under the weight of their own hatred. The lesson was clear in an age of social media accountability. No platform is big enough to protect you from the consequences of your actions. And no amount of bluster can save you when you come up against someone who's smarter, better prepared, and unafraid to call you out for exactly what you are. Tucker Carlson thought he could humiliate Jasmine Crockett on live television. Instead, she ended his career and showed the world that the age of fear-mongering cable news bullies was finally coming to an end.